1868, under the leadership of Bishop James Alexander Shorter, organized AME churches throughout the state of Tennessee and particularly here in the city of Franklin.
The AME Church had already been in existence, starting in Philadelphia. It had spread across the northern states, through Ohio and Chicago, but it was just starting to make inroads into Nashville and Tennessee, really only after the Civil War. What we need to think about in the context of that was that this was in the years right after the Civil War had ended. Most of the African Americans who were living in Williamson County had been enslaved. They would have been taken to worship with whoever enslaved them. Some of them may have gone to church at the Episcopal Church, where I go, which is how I actually first got interested in researching Shorter's history. And I was researching our history and started finding references to enslaved people being baptized at St. Paul's Episcopal Church and a funeral being conducted by one of our priests. And I wanted to know more about who these people were and where they went when the Civil War ended. I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize, that most of the population at that time were African American here in Williamson County. Shorter Chapel was formed was organized in 1868, just 3 years after the end of the Civil War. And then by April of 1872, just about 4 years later, those early parishioners had saved up $1,500, which was a lot of money, and they bought the building that had belonged to the White Methodist Church. And it was where today's brownstones are in downtown Franklin. It's on the corner of 2nd Avenue and Church Street. And it was a very big, very impressive building. It was like 2.5 stories tall, but it had been heavily damaged during the Civil War. And so it was like a fixer-upper when they bought it. Newspaper articles talk about how they very quickly had an organ and a choir. So they were very organized.
Shorter Chapel fits into the history of Franklin being the first African Methodist Episcopal Church. And it has played a major role in the black community in Franklin. In my study of Williamson County history, and particularly the African Americans' contribution to that history, and when you look at the membership of those members of Shorter Chapel, it's very easy to determine they were leaders in the black community in Franklin. It seemed to be the church where your doctors came from. We had Dr. Johnson, Dr. Hudson. It's where your teachers came from.
A long time ago, this is a professional church, We had doctors and we had nurses and we had teachers, and they were not snooty, if that's a good word. They were just Christian people, and they just helped anybody who needed help. So, Shorter, I think, has a very good reputation.
And what makes us different from other churches in this area is that we are known as the Church of Social Justice, the Church of Protest, or when it was formed 100 years ago, the Abolition Church.
Our denomination was formed in large measure for protection as well as for protest. For protection in the sense that it gave an opportunity for people of like mind to have support, but also for protest that those who did not acknowledge our humanity have to reckon with our humanity, and together we make that witness.
We know that in July of 1868, there was a series of lynchings right here in Franklin. And then in August of 1868, Shorter Chapel was formed. So that's sort of the backdrop against which these early parishioners decide to organize their own church. And I always think about it as like they were really creating a sanctuary. We think of a sanctuary as being a church building, but they were really creating their own sanctuary by coming together and trying to create safety a place of peace and a place where they could worship together. The church stayed at that location and in that building from the 1870s until 1925. And in December of 1924, they negotiated to swap the old church building for an empty lot on Natchez Street. Lots and lots of sort of oral history exists to the fact that the building was torn down brick by brick and carried over here to Folk Street and Natchez Street and rebuilt. The story is that they tore the church down and they had like a parade and people carried the bricks by hand. They had them in wheelbarrows and in carts. It's a beautiful story about that time and how they wanted to stay tied to the past.
I think the leaders of this church, of Shorter Chapel, were very smart in looking at the future and saying, we need to be in the heart of the black community. And so they chose this site, which is right in the middle of the Natchez Street community.
When we started looking at the building and comparing it to photographs of the original Shorter Chapel Sanctuary, we realized that not only did they carry the bricks, they carried these beautiful stained glass windows with them. There's a cornerstone at the northeast corner of the church that I think was probably laid when the building was reconstructed in 1925. So I suspect there's a time capsule in the corner of the church, in the cornerstone.
We have one picture that was taken out here in front. There was a convention here of the Mosaic Society, which one of its members had them meet here, and the whole street is full of people. Hundreds of people coming from across Tennessee to meet here. That's really the first photograph we have of this church after it had moved to Natchez Street and Folk Street.
Shorter Chapel is important in the history of the church because it represents a part of our legacy in terms of what we have stood for and as well as what we've evolved to be. What you see is a place today that represents over 7 generations. These children and grandchildren, but for me, I have to go back to my great-grandfather to be in the generation represented at the founding of Shorter. It says that following the Civil War, when people did not have to worship because they were not compelled by a master or by even by a community, people had a desire to worship God, be in community, and to be supportive of each other and of family. And so as that legacy continues, it makes Shorter an important part of who we are and who we are becoming. The church is relevant today because God has not gone anyplace.
We are restoring our relationship to restoring our facility. And so we have a historic property that has great community value, and our bell tower, as well as other aspects of this facility need to maintenance and upgrading. And so to preserve this property for another 150 years, we are celebrating the accomplishments, not only of the past, but also looking towards the future to make certain that we are around for another 150 years.
And now you're going to hear from Dr. Kenneth Hill, who is minister of the Shorter Chapel AME Church.
The Green Book House was popularized by the movie, The Green Book. And yes, the property next door was owned by the Gaylord family. Again, Sister Thelma Battle and I think Laura Holder of MTSU, they have been writing about it. And so I've been learning more about the Gaylord family, which moved into that property about in the 1930s. in the 40s. They lived in that house, and in the 50s, of course, that's when segregation was at its height, and the property, she rented out rooms in the house as a safe haven for blacks who were traveling from across the country, who would come through the South, and they needed a place to stay. Franklin, during that time of segregation, during the height of segregation, was a sundown town, and that meant that blacks should not be caught at night, and they would not be guaranteed their safety. And so, but the Green Book House was a safe house. I would call it, I would say it's equivalent to, like, during the era of slavery, we had the Underground Railroad, right? We had to travel to the north for freedom. Well, I would characterize the era of doing segregation and this Green Book House, which is the only Green Book House in the city of Franklin, as the part of the Overground Railroad.
Okay, I like that.
And so blacks needed a place to stay as they traveled further south. And so the Green Book, which was written by Victor Hugo, a librarian in New York, I think, published a book where it had all the safe haven sites, restaurants, black hotels, black bed and breakfasts like the Green Book House, and other places where it would be safe for African Americans to travel up and down the interstate. The Green Book location, this particular house was one of the entries in the Green Book, the tourist book. And so in 1971, she sold the property to us, to Shorter Chapel. And so we have been the owners of that property since 1971 to the present. And so when we met, she said, well, let's look at it. We reconsidered our decision to demolish the house and to preserve made the decision, well, let's preserve this property for posterity's sake.